Greetings, everyone. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming. My name is Chuck Tooley, and I'm board chair of the Burton K. Wheeler Center. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to what I think you will find to be a fascinating and informative evening. We are indebted to Carmen McSpadden and the Leadership Institute for being the major sponsor of this event today, and Professor David Parker in the Political Science Department of MSU, and Montana Public Radio, and the Office of President of Montana State University. We're delighted to have Ambassador Michael McFaul as tonight's speaker, and you will hear more about him when he is introduced. But before that, I will speak briefly about the Wheeler Center and what we endeavor to do here in Montana. It started as a lecture series in the 1970s and became a 501c3 nonprofit in the late 80s. We expanded our offerings to include two-day conferences like early childhood education, the graying of Montana, campaign finance reform, the future of coal, divisiveness in democracy, agriculture and climate change, and the next economy. Our most recent conference was titled Media and Democracy in an Era of Mistrust. Because we are strictly nonpartisan in our approach to addressing issues, we find qualified panelists and speakers with different points of view to respectfully and rationally discuss the topics at hand. Our next conference will be in April here in Bozeman, addressing the subject of housing in Montana. In a separate activity, we engaged specialized course developers to create a seminar for college and university students titled Truth or Fiction, Making Sense of What You See and Hear, which is now being edited into shorter versions so they can also be provided at service clubs, community groups, and other audiences. The idea is to expose audience members to media literacy concepts and provide tools that can help them judge the credibility and accuracy of what they are seeing and hearing, from social media to cable TV to broadcast news to printed publication. The Wheeler Center vision is to strengthen democracy. We are doing that with programs and activities that educate, inspire, and build community, which is so desperately needed in America now. If any of you would like to know more about the Wheeler Center or just get in touch with us, simply go online to wheelercenter.org. I want to say at this point that the Wheeler Center is very proud and pleased to be affiliated with Montana State University. And one of the most delightful aspects of that affiliation is our relationship with University President Waded Cruzado. Dr. Cruzado sits on our board of directors and generously offers her support, advice, and accessibility. As the 12th president of Montana State University, Dr. Cruzado has served since 2010, leading the way to steady growth over that significant period of time. We're very happy that Dr. Cruzado is with us this evening to introduce our distinguished speakers. So, ladies and gentlemen, President Waded Cruzado.
Thank you, Chuck. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to your university, Montana State. On behalf of the Burton K. Wheeler Center, Montana Public Radio, and the MSU Leadership Institute, I'm pleased to welcome you to this very special event. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Michael McFaul, who will speak to us tonight about the Russian war in Ukraine. For all of us who want to better understand Russia's motivations, the human rights implications of the war, and how it is reshaping global politics and threatening global security, you have come to hear one of the foremost experts on this urgent topic. Dr. McFaul served as the United States ambassador to the Russian Federation under President Barack Obama from 2012 until 2014. He's widely recognized as one of the world's top experts on post-communist Russia. Prior to his appointment as ambassador, Dr. McFaul served for 3 years as special assistant to President Obama, and he was the senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs for the National Security Council. Indeed, Michael McFaul was the architect of President Obama's policy on Russia. Following his ambassadorship, Dr. McFaul returned to his faculty position at Stanford University, where he's a professor of political science. Dr. McFaul teaches courses on great power relations, democratization, comparative foreign policy decision-making, and revolutions. Dr. McFaul is also director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, as well as the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institute. Dr. McFaul also works as an analyst for NBC News, and he writes about international affairs for several national publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. In addition, Dr. McFaul has authored several books, including a New York Times bestseller, From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. Dr. McFaul received his bachelor's degree in international relations and Slavic languages and his master's degree in East European studies, both from Stanford University. He went on to receive a PhD in international relations from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. Over his career, Dr. Michael McFaul has accumulated a tremendous amount of national and international experience that has earned him a stellar reputation as a scholar and as a diplomat. But I should note that Dr. McFaul is also a Montanan. He was born in the northeastern town of Glasgow, and then his family moved to Butte, where his father, Kip, was a band director, music teacher, and a musician. We're delighted to have Dr. McFaul's father, mother, and sister with us here this evening. Welcome to all of you. After moving to Butte, the McFaul family then moved to Bozeman before young Michael's junior year in high school. And he became involved in Bozeman High School's speech and debate team. As his mother, Helen, has said, the move to Bozeman and the immersion in speech changed Michael's life, helping him earn a scholarship to Stanford. In fact, I understand it was Dr. McFaul's involvement in Bozeman High's award-winning speech and debate team what initially sparked his interest in the study of Russia. And his debate partner in high school was someone else whose name may be familiar to some of you, U.S. Senator Steve Daines. In recognition of Michael McFaul's remarkable academic and diplomatic career, Montana State University awarded him an honorary doctorate degree in 2015, the highest recognition granted by the faculty and the Board of Regents of the Montana University system. I will confess, though, that since February of last year, when Russia invaded Ukraine again, many a times I have thought about Ambassador McFaul and have wished to have him share his wisdom about the events that led to that war, and for him to explain what does it mean from this point forward. I'm sure I was not the only one. And tonight, our wishes have been granted, as Dr. McFaul will present his lecture, Putin's War in Ukraine, Causes and Consequences. On behalf of the Burton K. Wheeler Center, Montana Public Radio, the MSU Leadership Institute, and the faculty, student, staff, and alumni of Montana State University, it is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael McFaul.
It's up there? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Wow, that was an incredible introduction. I'm afraid I'm not going to live up to it, but thank you for having me here at the Wheeler Center. Thank you, President Cruzado, for having me back. The last time you invited me to speak was really scary in front of 9,000 people. This is a little easier for me, and I have slides. But you all are lucky to have her, by the way. This is a fantastic university. As I was just saying, we're looking for a new president at Stanford, so pay her well. Seriously, it's a great honor to be back. It's great to be back home. Montana State, I didn't go to school here, but I did my first research here up at the library as a debater, my junior year in high school. I spent a lot of time at MSU libraries. I think I was doing a lot more studying than most of the students were, by the way. There was a lot of flirtation going on with the college kids. And yes, Steve Daines was my debate partner my junior year, but I want to mention my senior year partner was a guy named Scott Strobel, who is now the provost of Yale University. So think about that, speech and debate. Are there any speech and debaters here, by the way? Yes, in the back row. Thanks for coming. It did change my life, and I'm glad to see you all here tonight. Second thing I want to say, since we agreed to do this talk, tragically, there is another big war happening in the world, in the Middle East, triggered by the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel, October 7th. I debated whether I should try to do those two talks together and decided that wouldn't be fair to you because maybe you didn't come to listen to that. But in questions, I want to encourage you, if you want to talk about those events, I'm very happy to talk about them. I'm just not going to talk about them in the formal remarks. But I'm happy to talk about them here or on Twitter all night long, @McFaul. Find me there, okay? And I am back for a much more tragic time than the last time I was here. It was already tough in U.S.-Russian relations the last time I spoke here, but it's gotten a lot worse since my last visit to Montana State. I think we're living in really scary times, folks. And just because it's not on TV, I want to remind you why it is so scary today. For the first time since World War II, we have a major conventional war underway in Europe today. Second, this is the first time, really since 1939, that we've had major annexation. We could talk about 40, but since World War II, that we've had major annexation in the world. There are other places in the world where there's been annexations. I'm happy to talk about that in questions, but nothing on the scale of what Vladimir Putin is trying to carry out today. Third, and now I think I have to add the Middle East to this bullet point, but for a long time, the threat of great power war was gone after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the possibility is back. That's something new. And fourth, we are in a period where the leaders of Russia, Mr. Putin in particular, is threatening to use nuclear weapons, you got to go all the way back to 1962 and maybe back to 1945 when we've had a time when great leaders with nuclear weapons were threatening to use them. So it's a pretty sobering, scary time. And what I want to do tonight is I want to explain. I want to answer 4 questions. First, how did we get here? Second, where are we now? Third, where are we going? Parentheses, I don't know, but I'm going to explain why I don't know. And fourth, why should you care? And I'm going to spend most of my time on number 1, because I think the other ones are more speculative, and you can watch me on TV and talk about points 2 and 3 and 4 perhaps. But I think in order to understand where we're at, you really have to go into this history. So forgive me if this is going to sound more like history than contemporary politics, but I think it's important to have the diagnostics before we think about prescriptions. So first, how did we get here? In my world, there's kind of 3 big explanations. The first is what power politics. And it's pretty simple. It's that great powers go to war. Great powers annex each other. Rising powers annex territory. This is just a couple hundred years of European history to remind you of what it was like before 1945. And you know, whether it's good or bad, that's for another debate. This is just the way the world is. And what we're seeing today is the rise of Russia again. So Russia was weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but 30 years later, they're back with their power. And who should be surprised if they're trying to annex their neighbors? That's what they've been doing for 1,000 years. And by the way, other countries that have the power to do so as well. And I want to be clear, power matters a lot in international relations. That's why we're going to start with power. You're not interested in a talk on U.S.-Kyrgyz relations. Maybe somebody is. Anybody from Kyrgyzstan here? No, okay, good. I love Kyrgyzstan. I used to go there all the time in the government. But Kyrgyzstan doesn't have the power to invade its neighbors. And I could Guinea-Bissau, Moldova, name whatever country you want that doesn't have power. So power matters, right? We're not concerned about Moldova starting World War III. We're concerned about places like Russia, and I'm concerned about places like China and Iran as well. So power matters. Power matters a lot. But it's not the whole story for a couple of reasons. One, I can think of some countries that got more powerful and didn't invade their neighbors, right? So think about Japan and Germany after World War II. They're way more powerful today compared to 45. I'm not worried about them invading their neighbors. Italy, even Poland today is way more powerful compared to 1989. I'm not worried about them invading their neighbors. There was a time in our history when our neighbors worried about us invading them, and we did a lot, and we annexed a lot of territory. I'm not worried about that. Anybody from Alberta, Saskatchewan? You should not be worried. We are not. We have the power, we have the capability to invade you. If you're from those provinces, we're not going to do it. At least I'm not losing any sleep over it. So that suggests that there's got to be more to the story than just power, right? Because powerful states that have capabilities to annex the neighbors, their neighbors like we do, and these other countries, they're not doing it. The other piece of it is why now? Russia had this power 10, 15, even 20 years ago. Why is it happening now? There's got to be more to the story than just power. All right, second explanation. This one is popular in Moscow. It's popular in Beijing. It's popular at Harvard and Berkeley. And actually, it's popular in certain circles in the United States of America. And if you're an American, I don't want to presume I know where everybody's from, the punchline here, it's all our fault. We did this. We brought this on. And it has to do with NATO expansion, our alliance in Europe that's been around since 1949. And the argument goes like this. Soviet Union collapsed, their alliance collapsed, Warsaw Pact collapsed. NATO should have collapsed too, but we didn't. Instead, we just kept expanding NATO. These are the various periods of NATO expansion. And finally, Putin said, enough is enough. I have to push back on NATO coming at me, this enemy of the Soviet Union, enemy of Russia, and I'm going to stop NATO expansion by invading Ukraine, and actually invading Ukraine a second time. That's the right way to put it, as the president herself said last year. And again, there's a bit of truth here, right? NATO relations with the Soviet Union and Russia have been complicated. I don't want to dismiss that. But I would say it's been a variable, not a constant. And that actually, we were doing a pretty good job of managing relations between Russia and NATO when I was in the government, and I would say successive, the Trump administration and the Biden administration as well. And just, if you don't believe me, believe some of these Russian analysts. These are Russians now speaking. This is not Mike McFaul, apologist for NATO expansion. I think NATO expansion was fantastic, and I was just in Estonia a few months ago. Believe me, they think that too. But for those that are skeptical, just read some of this commentary from Russians, not from people like me. You can read it yourself. Here's a Russian strategic analyst saying NATO's not the enemy. Guess who that was? Putin. Putin said that. Not Mike McFaul. Putin said that. Or here's another one about you. Oh, there is Putin in 2001. Here's another one about Ukraine's membership in NATO. Read the, you can read. I don't have to read it. In fact, I can't see it, so you got to read it. It's a matter for those two partners. Knock yourself out. You NATO, Ukraine. Yeah, you know the game. Who said that? Putin. Here's another one, more recently. This was at the NATO summit. I was there with President Obama in Lisbon in 2010. And this Russian analyst said, it's all over. We're cooperating with NATO. Cold War tensions, it's over. You can read it, right? Period of distance in our relations and claims against each other is now over. Who said that? President Medvedev. And it was so crazy back then, folks. It was off the record. But behind closed doors at that meeting, we were talking about building missile defenses with Russia together against other enemies. That's how cooperative the relationship was between NATO and Russia. So there's got to be something more to this story, it seems to me. Instead of it's all our fault, I would only add that right in the run-up to this tragic, horrific, barbaric invasion of Ukraine last February 2022, there was no momentum whatsoever for Ukraine to join NATO. If you believe that, that's what Putin wants you to believe. And I'm here to tell you that since 2008, at this very ambiguous NATO summit where there was mixed signaling, basically our allies in Europe didn't want Ukraine to come in, President Bush did, they agreed to some convoluted compromise, and nothing has happened between 2008 and today in terms of Ukrainian membership into NATO. No momentum whatsoever. And Moscow knew that, Putin knew that, Biden knew it, Zelensky knew it. And it's the mythology, it's the propaganda, the disinformation afterwards that Putin wants you to believe. It was all, they're almost going to get in, and then they didn't. In fact, I hosted Zelensky the day after he finally had his first Oval Office visit. You may remember there was some drama about that in the previous administration, whether he should get a visit or not. But he got that meeting, he saw President Biden, and the next day we hosted him at Stanford. And remember, he's a new leader. He'd never been president before. And that day, he kept asking me, he said, you're the diplomat. Tell me why you all just say you want us to join, but then privately you say you really don't want us to join. That's what he said the day after he saw President Biden. Putin knew that as well. So I think there's more to this story. And I think this third variable, this third factor, is the real driver. This has more to do with Putin and his domestic politics than it has to do with power or our foreign policy. And the simple story here, Putin was an accidental president, came in through a set of weird circumstances, which I don't have time to go into, but I've written a book about it, From Cold War to Hot Peace, $4.95 on Amazon right now. You can get it if you want to go through that history. But it's a long, complicated history, but basically he came in an accidental way in 2000, and for 20 years has been making Russia more and more autocratic. It's now as autocratic as it was in the Soviet Union. Friends of mine are imprisoned because of this dictator, human rights activists, people like Alexei Navalny. And as countries become more autocratic, there's more tension with the democratic world. I think that's a general tendency one thinks about around the world, and I'm going to get to that at the end of my remarks. And as he was becoming more autocratic, his neighborhood was becoming more democratic. Serbia, 2000, big revolution there. Then Georgia, the country, not the state, 2003. Orange Revolution in Ukraine, 2004. They were becoming more democratic as he was becoming more autocratic, and he thought we were behind all of this. And by the way, he's partially right. We were behind some of this. We can talk about that in questions. So when we got into the government, we flew to Moscow in 2009, and we had a big debate about this. And Putin went on. He was loaded for bear, by the way. He had a lot to get off his chest. This was his first time seeing President Obama. He just went on and on about the horrors of the Bush administration. Never President Bush, by the way. He's really fond of President Bush himself, but he's kind of a deep state guy. You know, he's got this deep state theory, the Pentagon, the CIA, presidents come and go, but they're running everything. And he went on for, I think, 58 minutes before President Obama spoke. And the reason I know that is you can see me there, I'm taking notes. I was supposed to brief the press corps, the White House press corps, after this meeting. It was scheduled for an hour. And we got to minute 58, and my guy hadn't said a word, and I was scared to death. What am I going to tell the press? It went on for 3.5 hours, and we had some things to talk about, but I was nervous about that. But his big thing was just about what I just said. You guys are going all over the world, doing regime change, even invading countries, right? He talked a lot about Iraq. And President Obama said, we're not going to do that anymore. He said, you may not know this, but part of the reason I won the Democratic primary, and President Obama did, was because he was against the war in Iraq. And he just said, we're not going to do regime change. We're not going to be invading countries. I'm different. And, you know, as we were walking out, and I speak Russian, I was listening to Putin, I could tell that maybe he thought President Obama and our administration were going to be different. But then things happen in the world that you don't control for. And in 2011, there was something called the Arab Spring. And I want to be crystal clear, we did not start this. This was our ally, Mubarak, that was overthrown by small d Democrats in Egypt. We managed it. We had to react to it. But the idea that we were behind this is completely false. We were reacting to it. But that's not Putin's view. When he saw this, and then he saw this, and then he saw this, he's like, aha, CIA, there they are. This Obama guy, he's not in charge. It's the deep state. They're running their same old play, just like they did before. And then the same year, it's really important to remember, the same exact year, 2011, it happened in Russia, when hundreds of thousands of people came out to demonstrate against a falsified election. I remember I was working at the White House. We estimated it'd be 6 or 7% was falsified. For Russia, that's no big deal. That's just a normal election in Russia. But these people had a different view. This is the middle class, and their property, no taxation without representation. Remember that phrase? That's the one they were using. How can you steal our vote when you take our taxes? And then they had smartphones, and they used Facebook and VKontakte and Twitter, and suddenly hundreds of thousands of people were protesting first for a better and cleaner election. But then you get 100,000 people together, they get a little worked up, right? And by the end of these demonstrations, they were yelling, Россия без Путина, Russia without Putin. In other words, they wanted what was happening in the Middle East. And the last time that had happened in Russia was exactly 20 years earlier, 1991. That's the year the Soviet Union did collapse. That's the year it all fell apart. By the way, if you squint, you can see me. I'm right there. And Putin knows I was there. And this, to me, was the end of it with Putin in terms of dealing with us in the West. He needed an argument to explain why these people were mobilizing, so he had to blame us. And when I say us, I mean the United States, principally, Europe, liberal democracies more generally. And ever since, he's been blaming us for everything that's gone wrong in his country, and blaming President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and me for fomenting revolution. And this is right when I parachuted in to become the U.S. ambassador. And I became the target. This is just a sidebar here on me for a couple of slides. But I became the target of this, that McFaul was sent to Russia to organize the revolution against Putin. And a couple of times, Putin told me that directly. He says, we know what you're here to do, and we are going to stop you. As I said in my student session earlier today, that was one of the scariest conversations I'd ever had. My bodyguards were on the other side of his fence. His bodyguards were there. And I became kind of the poster child of this argument for the time I was ambassador. And when I say poster child, I mean literally poster child. This is a calendar they put out with me. You know, you've heard of a lot of disinformation before. I've been dealing with disinformation for a long time. That's photoshopped, me allegedly campaigning for the leading opposition figure at the time, Alexei Navalny. That's a t-shirt that says Navalny. This on the left is a poster that was at bus stops. And it says the political circus is coming to town again. And it was a massive demonstration that the opposition was planning for May 2012. And I am listed there as the artistic director. That's me, if you can see me there. By the way, of the other people that are there, two are in jail. One has a 25-year sentence, one has a 23-year sentence, and the rest are in exile. And then the last straw. Hope you're getting the feel, right? I'm showing you a lot of different countries with a lot of people protesting for democracy. And then this one happened 2 years later from what I just showed you. This is now Ukraine and the fall of President Yanukovych, Putin ally. The Ukrainians call it the revolution of dignity. Putin calls it a neo-Nazi American-sponsored coup. And that's when he said enough is enough. That's when he invaded the first time in 2014. And when he didn't crush democracy that time, that's when he decided to go in again last year. Because what he really fears is not NATO expansion. He fears democratic expansion. And there's one more piece to this that's really important to understand. Putin tells his people in Russia that we're different. We're not like you decadent liberal Westerners. And he's using those words in very specific terms. I'm not making not a liberal conservative argument that we have here in our country, but we're not like the West. This democracy stuff, that's not for us. We're different. We're Slavic people. We have different traditions. In fact, I remember vividly when I heard this from him himself. I was there with Vice President Biden, and we were arguing about Georgia, and he looked at the president. So you're now Biden, I'm Putin, okay? And I don't know your political affiliation. I don't mean to offend you, just for purposes. So he stares at him, right? And he's pointing at him. He says, you know what your problem is? You guys look at us. And he went like this. And we think alike because we look alike. He's, the skin. But we don't. We're different. It's really, whoa, we all walked out of that. And then I was thinking, does he know who my president is? But like he really wanted us to know, we're not part of you. We're not part of Europe. But then he's got this argument in the war that Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. They're just like, he wants to unite all the Slavic people. Well, if the Ukrainians are practicing democracy, that undermines his argument back home. And that's why he is so fearful that he needs to try to destroy what is happening in Ukraine today. And then the older he's gotten, he's just becoming a kind of old-fashioned imperialist. I don't know, when you get old, you come up with kookier and kookier ideas. And he just wants to be the next Catherine the Great. She was the one that brought Crimea in, and Novorossiya, that's the place where they're fighting now. He wants to be known in Russian history books just like those two other leaders, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. All right, so that's how we got here. That's where we're at. That's the explanation. Where are we now? These will be shorter, don't worry. These next three will be a lot shorter. Right now, we're in a tricky space in that the first year of the war, I would argue, Putin lost. 2022, he lost. He did not achieve any of his core objectives. And by the way, it's not just me making these up. These are the things he himself said were the goals for Russia when they invaded last February. And unite all the Russians, right? I just said that's the argument he made to his people before he invaded. They're going to welcome us, with flowers because we're all Slavs together. He then promised to get rid of the Nazis that are running Ukraine. Remember, I told you it was a Nazi coup. And the leader of the Nazis is the Jewish democratically elected president of Ukraine. Just remember that. I just saw him last month, by the way. He looks a lot older than that photo that I showed you when he was at campus. And we were kind of, the absurdity of that claim, he was reflecting on that. Third, he wanted to demilitarize Ukraine. Fourth, he wanted to take over all Ukraine and make it part of the Russian Federation, Russian Empire. And fifth, he wanted to stop NATO expansion, right? Those were his arguments. And on all five of them, I'll go through these quickly, he's failed miserably. So there's the data from Ukraine. Think about it. If somebody came over, and I don't mean to keep talking about Saskatchewan, but if somebody came over and invaded us, would we want to say, oh, we want to be part of Canada now that you're invading us? No. You know what it was like. I can see people here lived through September 11th. Not everybody did, but it brought us together. That's what happened to the Ukrainians. They are fully united against the invaders. Second, I already told you, denazification didn't work. We said, we'll give you a ride to Poland, and President Zelensky said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, right? That's the very famous photo that he took, by the way, on Instagram. He's a great communicator, and he's still there. I just saw him in his presidential offices just last month. Third, demilitarization, exact opposite. We are now approaching $50 billion of military assistance. Ukraine is more militarized today than in any period in its history. And fifth, on the war itself, there was progress, right? He did make progress. It looks like that's stuck. That's okay. But they've now been repelled. 50% of the territory that was taken has now been liberated. So occupying all of Ukraine, of course, has not happened. And fifth and finally, NATO expansion. Because of the war, we have two new powerful, really powerful allies that are coming in. One that's in Finland and one that's on the way, Sweden. But where are we today? This year has not been so great. Putin's modified his objectives. He's no longer trying to take all of Ukraine. He's now trying to take what Catherine the Great called Novorossiya, these four territories, these four regions. He's formally annexed them in a big signing ceremony in Moscow, but on the ground, he still hasn't taken them. I think this is his new short-term objective, and he'll fight until he captures them, and he's hoping that we'll lose interest and allow him to do that. The Ukrainians, of course, have the opposite objectives. They were hoping to liberate those territories this spring and fall. They have not done so. That has been a very frustrating fight for them, I can tell you from having just been there. And of course, their long-term objectives, they have not changed their mind at all. They want to liberate all of their territory, including Crimea. By the way, it's a democracy. 90% of Ukrainians support these objectives. So when you hear commentators on TV saying, well, they should just give some land for peace and everybody would be happy, you got to remember Zelensky can't just do that. He's not a dictator like Putin. He would be thrown out of office in a heartbeat if he went for that kind of deal. And that leads to a pretty stark picture that we're in today. Some call it a stalemate. I'm not prepared to do so because I've studied too many wars. This is just year two. I think there's a good chance now that if they have the proper weapons for their next offensive, that they may push forward. Most certainly, the Minister of Defense, who I saw last month, believes so. They just did not have the weapons they needed to do the counteroffensive that they had so much pressure to do. But I want to be honest with you. I don't know. I don't know how the war is going to end. And you shouldn't believe anybody who tells you that they know how the war is going to end. It feels very uncertain right now. I can go through the scenarios. I won't do them. I think it's highly unlikely that Putin achieves his big objectives, but he may achieve these shorter-term objectives. And first and foremost, what we do will matter to that. Likewise, I still think Ukrainian full victory is a possibility, but if I had to bet, we'll probably be somewhere in the middle the next time you invite me to speak here, tragically. And so that gets me to the last point I want to make tonight. Why should you care? And I think there's two big reasons why you should care, at least why I care, and I hope maybe I can convince you that you should care. First, I actually think our country is a moral country, folks. I think we believe in things. I think we stand for certain ideals. Most certainly, it's part of what animated me to join the government. And this idea that, well, what's in it for me, that I hear, from opponents of helping Ukraine, I still believe that we are not just like any other country. We're not just like those imperial countries I showed you in the beginning map. I personally think colonialism is wrong. I hope Americans agree with me. I think annexation is wrong. I think it is immoral to stand by and watch civilians slaughtered, soldiers tortured, women raped, children kidnapped. As an American and as a citizen of the world, I want to be against those things because they're the right things to be against, not because it's materially or in my security interests for me personally or as a country. And I also believe, because this is a dictatorship invading a democracy, that we should care about that too, as one of the oldest democracies in the world and as one of the most powerful democracies in the world. I'm with Winston Churchill here, folks. Yeah, it's a horrible system of government. Feels pretty horrible in our country right now. I got it. I'm cautiously optimistic we'll get out of the moment we're in. But yeah, it's a horrible system of government, except for all of the others. I'm with Churchill on this. These are moral reasons. But I'm not going to assume everybody has the same morality in this room as I do. So I'm going to give you some just hardcore security reasons why you should care about who wins in this war. Things that will affect us, and if you have members of your family serving in the armed forces, that will directly affect you. So in Europe, if Ukraine wins, the Russian threat to our NATO allies will be diminished. Ukrainian warriors are eliminating that threat every single day so that we don't have to. And that sounds cynical and harsh, but they're not afraid to say that. They're just saying, give us the guns so we can defeat this threat that is a threat to the rest of NATO. And if they do, the threat will be diminished. Remember, I showed you the maps of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire included Finland. It included Poland. It included Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And there are Russian leaders today that say, it's time to bring the whole empire back. That threat will diminish if Ukraine prevails. And we will have to spend less money protecting our allies in Europe, and we'll have to have less American soldiers in the Baltics and Poland. And the exact opposite is true if Putin wins. They'll be more threatened. We'll have to spend more money in Europe. We'll have to send more soldiers to defend those countries. That, I don't think, is in our long-term strategic interest. Second, I think it has implications over in Asia as well. And I think it's just really clear-cut. If Putin loses, Xi Jinping is going to think a little bit harder about making that horrific, horrible decision to try to annex and invade Taiwan. But if Putin wins, and we look like we were weak, and we didn't care, oh, that's not my problem, that's far away, where's Ukraine, that's not my problem, he will be emboldened to make that move. And it'll confirm his hypothesis that our glory days are in the past. That's what Xi Jinping believes. But don't believe me, go to Taiwan, as I did last summer. That's President Tsai. There are no group of people on the planet cheering louder for the Ukrainians than the people of Taiwan, because they understand this relationship very clearly. And third, and more broadly, I just think it means the world tilts a little bit more towards the bad guys if Putin wins. And against this Democrats, small d Democrats, and democracies in the world if Putin wins. And conversely, if the Ukrainians win, other countries around the world, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, might just lean a little bit more towards us and the democratic world. And in fact, this is a false dichotomy between these morals and security things, because I actually think they're intertwined. Think about it for a moment. How many democracies have invaded our country? How many autocracies have we gone to war with? Straight up, We can talk, in questions, we can talk about the War of 1812. I'm happy to do that. But generally speaking, there's a pretty clear pattern, right? Think about today. What are the countries that you are worried about in terms of American national interests? China, Russia, Iran. Maybe you're worried about North Korea. Maybe you're worried about Hamas. What do they all have in common? They are not supporters of democracy. So I think these things matter to us. Likewise, the success of old autocracies becoming democracies have made us better off. And in the long run, it's the topic of the book I'm writing right now, if we're going to have a long-term competition with China first and foremost, but Russia and Iran and others, one of our greatest advantages are not our weapons, and it's not even our fantastic economy. It is our ideals and our ideas. So to throw that away, I actually think makes it harder for us to advance our security interests around the world. And here, I think Madeleine Albright was right. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. So, I think the conclusion is pretty clear. We have to be in this for the long run. Our task remains to help the Ukrainians win more military and economic aid, more and better sanctions, because it's in our interest to do so, because it supports our values to do so, and in the long run, a victory for Ukraine is actually a victory for all those that believe in democracy. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Want to go over here? Okay.
Feel like we should have a drink. Too.
Yeah, I could use a drink if anybody has one. I didn't drink at the reception, but I will shortly, yes.
So Ambassador McFaul has been with us all afternoon, and we gave him several rounds of applause, and he said to hold off on that he didn't deserve it until he spoke. And I feel like he does deserve it now, so can we all give him another round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a real privilege to have you here. So we're gonna, I'm Laurel Angell, I'm the executive director of the Wheeler Center, and it's great to see so many faces out there. Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful fall night, right? So we're gonna just do a few questions between us, and then we're gonna have Brian walk around with the microphone and take questions from the audience. So I think probably 20 or so minutes of questions,
Sure.
if that's okay with you.
Fine, yeah. You can ask me anything, by the way. It doesn't have to be about this. You can talk about Barack Obama's jump shot. It's not as good as he thinks it is. But sorry, I didn't mean to.
And you told him that.
I never told him that in
That's
person.
Ambassador McFaul was nice enough earlier today, too, to do a master class with the Leadership Institute, a really great hour with 40 students here from MSU who drilled him with questions. I think they were very great questions. And we had such a great conversation, and he told us a lot of inside stories. So we appreciated all that time, and there were so many questions that we still have a few left from that class. So I will ask you, and this was Bryce's question, if Russia picks a side in the Israel-Hamas conflict, how will diplomatic relations with the United States be impacted?
It's a great question, Bryce. To back up, I apologize for the history, but I think it's important for context, and you want the right diagnoses before you talk about prescriptions, right? And for really since Putin became in power, but most certainly when I was in the government, Vladimir Putin had a pretty aggressive, and I would say rather successful strategy for strategic engagement in the Middle East with non-traditional Russian partners. It started with Israel, and it started with Prime Minister Netanyahu, where that courtship was real, and we didn't like it, I'll tell you honestly, but when I was in the government. As you all know, there are millions of immigrants from Russia in Israel, and on the kind of conservative values against terrorists They were coming together, and it was undermining some of our diplomacy with Israel at the time. Second, they have a long-standing relationship with Iran. And remember, Iran is now providing military assistance to Russia in their war in Ukraine. Iranian drones are killing Ukrainians today. Think about how strange that is, right? You always think of Russia helping the Iranians. Now it's reversed. But that's been long, and that's been there for a long time. And for a while, by the way, we used that to help us try to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And we did sign a deal. President Obama did. This was after I was out of the government. But that was in a cooperative phase with Russia. But that relationship with Iran has always been steadfast. But next to it, he started to court some of the Arab countries, and particularly the monarchies in the region, because he wanted to offset and diversify their relationships. And particularly with MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia, that relationship has gotten much closer over the last years. And I can tell you, a friend of mine's in charge of the Middle East at the White House, we didn't like it. We didn't like watching it, but we felt like we were being outplayed. This tragic, horrific terrorist attacks on October 7th suddenly caused everybody to decide, well, what side are you going to be on? And Putin has completely thrown Israel under the bus. And don't believe me, this is what my Israeli colleagues, but you can see it. He decided when push comes to shove, we got to be with Iran. Iran, their proxies are Hamas and Hezbollah, and they're all allied. So I think the bad news is that I don't see. There was, some talk that maybe Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping might be able to work with us to prevent this war from becoming bigger. And they're still working that. I want to be clear about that. And we can get to Xi Jinping if you're interested in a minute, because they have been more active in the Middle East. But I don't see many signs of it. At the end of the day, despite, the way that the world is voting against Israel and us, we're the biggest player. In terms of humanitarian assistance. They're talking about that it should come in. President Biden is actually bringing it in. And they're really just standing on the sidelines supporting Iran and by implication Hamas and Hezbollah. In fact, Hamas leaders were just in Moscow a short time ago. I hope that in the long run that might be more clarifying to the leaders of Israel that this flirtation that they were with was not in their long-term interest, but I think it's too early to know.
In thinking about that as well, we know there's been a lot of discussion about the Speaker of the House and Ukraine aid and Israel aid, and there's a lot of chaos, I would call it, over there on that side. So in thinking about the United States, can isolationism come back in the U.S. when we look at what's going on at this moment with the polarization?
Yes. I think to understand our period today, you should study the 1930s. Senator Wheeler actually was quite active in that period. And history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And there are periods where countries are very active and then we pull back, and we've done that over our history the last 70 or 80 years, where and there's a great book on it by Steve Sestanovich, where there's expansionist periods and we pull back in terms of engagement throughout the Cold War. Then it happened after September 11. We got really engaged. Obama was a retrenchment president. He wanted to pull back. President Trump was even a more retrenchment president. President Biden, who I worked with, I know him well, he wanted to re-engage, but there are strong, currents in American society in both parties. This is not a partisan issue at all, that want to return to more isolationist policies. And I want to be clear, I'm sympathetic to that. Like we spent a lot of, lost a lot of lives and a lot of treasure in Afghanistan and Iraq. There is I understand the sentiment, just like there was after World War I. Well, why were we there? What were we doing? And our leaders have to answer those questions. But I think you should study the 30s, and you should look at what Americans were saying. And, when the Japanese went into China, people are like, well, that's not our problem. They're way over there. Japanese, that's not our problem. Italians went into Ethiopia. It's like, Ethiopia, where's that? That's not our problem. Hitler, started annexing territory. He did it peacefully. It's like, okay, this is all going to work out. And then he annexed Poland, by the way, the Soviets did too, and other places. And even up until 1941, there were millions of Americans saying, well, that's too bad for Poland, but that's not our problem. And then it became our problem in a huge, horrific way. So rather than waiting till things get really bad, my message is, let's be in now with the Ukrainians, and I would say the same with Taiwan. And with Taiwan, it's to deter a war. We don't have to fight a war with the Chinese. I'm very optimistic that with the right strategy of engagement with Taiwan, with our allies in Asia, we do not have to stumble into that war, but we gotta be engaged to do it. We cannot sit on the sidelines. And on the specifics of the assistance, it looks like they're going to split it off, and we're going to have a vote on Israeli assistance to Israel first, Ukraine second. I'm all for that because the last vote before Speaker McCarthy, I don't even know how to describe it. He took out the Ukraine money right before to appease a certain constituency in his party, and then they voted him out of office. So, I'm not sure that worked out so well for him. I know Speaker McCarthy, he should have kept the money in. Who knows? I'm not an expert on American politics, but there was a straw vote 2 days before he was voted out of office, and by a 3-1 margin, the House of Representatives voted for more Ukraine assistance, standalone vote, 311 to 111. So when people say there's fading, by the way, public opinion is still solid, but that was a vote right before it. With the new configuration, they're now saying, well, we want to have stand-up votes on these things independently. I like this Biden strategy, but if you have to divide, you have to, but don't let the Ukrainian vote be linked to other things. That's what I fear. I fear it's going to be linked to all kinds of other things. They're going to say, we want a straight-up vote on this one, but now when we get to Ukraine, we're going to link it to immigration reform and the border and other things. That bait and switch, I think, would be inappropriate.
Thank you. Brian, I think we'll take some questions. There's a lot of questions, yeah. So go ahead.
You earlier touched on, the media and what we can believe and what we can't.
Yeah.
And I read how the Russians are just, putting soldiers into a meat grinder.
Yeah.
And the Soviet economy is going down, or is suffering greatly, I should say. And I guess I'm trying to understand, what do I really believe what they're saying about this, or is it kind of cheerleading us on? And that would lead to, my personal opinion is, I just figured Putin would get taken out before this, really hurts his country.
Right.
And my question is, what is there some threat of that, hope of that, whatever?
There are most certainly people I know that are hoping for it, I can tell you honestly. People that are in jail. Alexei Navalny, I don't think he would not, he'd be a little more diplomatic about it, but he's not getting out of jail while Putin's alive. So, I think it's a low probability event for 2 reasons. One, it's not going to happen through a social revolution that overthrows him, because he's cracked down, he's arrested these people, he's put them in jail, and, thousands of them. People initially protested against the war, and then he started to arrest people and arrest their families. Tens of thousands of those people that are against the war have now left the country, right? So those most opposed are living in Georgia, Kazakhstan, Lithuania, California, and they're not there trying to overthrow him. So I think that's a low probability event. Second, there was a coup attempt or quasi-coup attempt against him, this guy Prigozhin, that was all very murky about, overthrowing at least his minister of defense and maybe him. And if you look, you'll see that Putin is a very cautious guy. He has food testers. He sits very far away from other leaders. He's very cautious. So I think he's probably thinking about the same things you are thinking about and taking precautions. So I think it's probably a low probability event. But the thing I'll say, it was mentioned in my introduction, I teach a course on revolutions at Stanford. I've been teaching it for 30 years. And what I would say about revolutions, what I have said in print, it's something people have quoted me of saying, before they happen, they seem impossible. And after they happen, they seem inevitable. I don't think this is a stable system in Russia today for the reasons you just described. And the more, they are suppressing information inside Russia. They don't tell their people about the lives lost that you just said. They don't report the facts of their economy. You will not see that on Russian television, right? But people begin to feel it. And the bodies, when they come home, it's more and more societies are feeling the losses, and they don't really understand what this war is about. It's about Nazis and NATO, but really the Ukrainians were going to attack us? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And there's another thing going on inside Russia that doesn't get attention. The soldiers that are being drafted are coming from rural, poor parts of Russia. It's not the kids from Moscow, elite. They're all fine, right, through corruption. That eventually will come back, I think, to haunt Putin. So I don't want to pretend I can predict that, but I think that he's got long-term problems that he does not have easy answers to.
Thank you. And if we could keep questions succinct with everyone here, because there's a lot of people here with questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I'm a political science professor here at the Montana State
Professor
University.
Han, first year at Montana State, right?
Okay.
Welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So when we study a political event or like a war, we analyze a lot of factors and influence mechanism, like the political leader's personality and institutional environment, like autocracy versus democracy. So I'm wondering, based on your academic knowledge and your work experience with so many different political leaders around the world, so what is your views on how the political leaders' personality interact with the institutional environment that will affect the decision making, starting a war, like Putin, Zelensky, and here Obama, and also in China we have Xi Jinping and former president Chairman Mao. So do you think there's a big difference between the political influence of political leaders' personality in autocracy versus in democracy?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And I've struggled with that question in my academic research for a long time. And now that I have tenure, you don't have tenure yet, right? All right, so you can't, this is not good advice for you, but now that I have tenure, rather than just one causal variable to explain outcomes, I'm very comfortable with multi-causal analysis, right? So does power matter? Power matters. Does regime matter? Regime type matters, right? Autocracies versus democracies. But within that, even in autocracies, I think leaders do matter. And the book I'm writing right now has a whole chapter on Xi Jinping, Putin, and the leadership changes in the United States, because I think even within those systems, the change of leader matters. And let me tell you about Russia, because Putin, as I said in my slide, he was an accidental president. There was not some groundswell of support for him. He worked for Yeltsin. And then there was a financial crash in 1998, and the heir apparent that everybody thought was going to be the next president, his name was Boris Nemtsov. He was a personal friend of mine. And because of the meltdown of the economy in Thailand and then South Korea, that then, we call these exogenous shocks in political science, right? Got to Russia, the democratically elected government had to be dissolved because it was still a democracy. And Boris Nemtsov had to be pushed aside, and this no-name guy who was the only guy they could get through the parliament to be loyal to Yeltsin, Putin, that's how he became president. And had Nemtsov been president in 2000 instead of Putin, I think the history would have been very different. Because he was a Democrat, he supported the Orange Revolution I talked about, and by the way, he was such a threat to Putin that in 2015, he was assassinated. So I think leaders matter a lot, and I think we have to study them more. We just have to have them as part of our analysis. And I'll say the other reason why I think leaders matter is in the abstract, we have our theories and you don't see them, but when you're sitting at the White House and you're sitting with President Obama and he's making a decision, the idea that it's America has interests and America thinks this, America does that, it seems so absurd. Like, no, this is Barack Obama making this decision. By the way, when I was ambassador, because this is ingrained in our way of thinking, I used to get these cables, they're called, right? It's kind of absurd. Like, we don't have cables anymore. We have email, but they're still called cables. And my diplomats would write them, and I would have to sign them out. And I would get these cables saying, Russia believes this. Russia thinks this. Russia wants this. And I would never let them out. I was like, I've never met Mr. Russia. I actually met Ms. Russia one time. She was at an event we had. But sorry for that stupid joke. But, think about that, about our country, right? Like, Americans think differently. Mr. Trump and Mr. Obama and Mr. Biden, would you just say they just all behave the same way in terms of foreign policy? That sounds absurd. So why do we think that other countries behave that way? China wants this. Russia believes that. Iran thinks this. I've been to Iran. There's a lot of people in Iran who can't stand the theocrats. And so we need to be very careful to think that they all think alike and that leaders don't matter. I think leaders matter a lot.
I will ask the question what not only I have in my head, also my parents and friends back in Ukraine having. Like, we afraid
You're
that...
from Ukraine?
Yeah.
Yeah, where are you from?
Khmelnytsky.
Okay, great. I can see you're wearing a Ukrainian t-shirt, right?
Yeah, thank
Great,
you.
thanks for being here.
Thank you. We all afraid that Vladimir Putin afraid followers so much, and if he will see that he losing this war, he will send missiles on nuclear power stations or send nuclear rockets to us just
Yes.
Because he afraid to failure. Do you think that it's possible, or he wouldn't risk and do that?
So that's a great question. What's your name?
Diana.
Diana, nice to meet you.
Nice
Thanks for
to
being
meet
here.
you too.
Dziękuję. The question is, will Putin, if things are desperate, will he use nuclear weapons or attack nuclear power plants, in Zaporizhia in particular? Diana, I want to tell you something. I have a slide about your question, and I took it out because literally I took it out last night. One of my research assistants, we were debating it, and we took it out because we think the probability of that happening is gone so low. So that's the good news. But it was just in the slide deck 24 hours earlier. So let me answer the question. It's a serious threat. When I worked in the government, and it's true, it should be true for our government at all times, there's people that do analysis and then people that do policy, right? So the CIA, they do the analysis, right? So Bill Burns, I used to work with him, he's the head of the CIA. His job is to go in and tell President Biden, what's the probability that Mr. Putin will use a nuclear war, will use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine? I think it's near zero against us, just to be clear, because that's mutual assured destruction, and he is not suicidal. If you look at how far he sits away from people because he's afraid of COVID, he's not suicidal. And I've known Putin, I've known him since 1991. Not exactly Facebook friends, but I've studied the guy for a long time. He's not suicidal, so that's not there. But using a tactical nuclear weapon in your country, that is Bill Burns' job to assess the probabilities. But even if it's a low probability, let's say it's 2%, it's the job of Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan to make that number from 2% go to 1%, 0.9, 0.8, 0.7, because if it happens, it's a horrific event for your country first and foremost, but for all of Europe and the world, right? And the nuclear taboo has been broken. That's bad for us all. I think the probability has gone down. If it was 5% before, I think it's much lower than that before. For a couple of reasons. One, I don't think there's a lot of military utility in doing it. And we've studied this at my institute very closely. It does not achieve the military results you might think. Americans usually think, oh, use of nuclear weapons, 1945, we used 2 nuclear weapons that ended World War II. That would not happen. If Putin used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, Ukrainians would not say, okay, we're going to stop fighting. It would be the exact opposite. There would be mobilization, even more mobilization against Ukraine, and there are all kinds of sleeper cells in Russia today that Ukraine has. It would lead to greater commitment to fight him, not less. Number 2, he would lose Xi Jinping, he would lose the global south, that they would not support him anymore. Number 3, he might even lose his own military, by the way. Think about it. You're losing the war, things are not going so well, you're thinking about your retirement, you're thinking about your kids, your grandkids, and then you get an order from this crazy guy in the Kremlin to drop a nuclear weapon. I'm not so sure if I were Putin, I would be confident that General Gerasimov would do that. And fourth, tragically, if it did happen, all bets would be off in terms of the kinds of weapons that we've been reluctant to send, and I think Putin knows that.
Thank you. A few more questions here. Brian's on the move. Don't worry.
Many in the Middle East are starting to accuse the United States policy as being hypocritical with respect to the war in Israel versus Hamas, saying that the United States was so against Russia going in, doing all the horrible things they've done in Ukraine, but now here's Israel has killed and mutilated more than 12, on a number basis, essentially more than 12 times the number of Israelis, considering Israel with a country of 8 million, Gaza with 2 million, roughly. Please speak to the pros and cons of thinking of us being hypocritical with respect to the human rights issues.
Yeah, that's a hard question. First of all, there's no moral equivalency between Hamas, let me be careful here. Hamas started this war. The horrific terrorist attacks that they inflicted on innocent people in Israel, that's the equivalency. That's what Putin has done to Ukraine, and that's what Hamas did. And therefore, in my view, Israel has the right to self-defense. And you look like you're old enough to remember September 11th. You think about what happened in our country. Was there anybody after that horrific attack on us that said, well, hey, maybe we should just sit down and talk to Al-Qaeda and Taliban. We should just try to negotiate and have a ceasefire with them? Nobody was saying that. You remember what, at least I wasn't. I remember it vividly. I was living in Washington at the time. I didn't know where my son was. It took me several hours to find him. That was not the feeling we had, that we had the right to self-defense. I believe that Israel has the right to self-defense to crush Hamas. At the same time, we should do all that we can to reduce the number of civilian casualties. Israel does not have the right to kill innocent civilians. Now, that's easy for me to say, sitting on the stage here, and it's very hard to do when you're fighting a war. It was very hard to do when we fought wars in the past. World War II, Vietnam, South Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq. It's very hard to do for Israeli leaders, but it doesn't mean that we should not be able to hold those two thoughts together at the same time. And I appreciate what the Biden administration is doing to try to eliminate, to reduce the casualties that are being inflicted inside Gaza today. It's not enough. I want more. I want it more vocal, but I think that's the correct strategy. At the same time, not but, I'm deliberately not using but, because I don't like the way this argument is getting polarized in our society. In the long run, we have to admit that our policies towards Palestinians, failed. We decided, I was there, I was there at a different time. When the Obama administration there, we had a special negotiator, Senator Mitchell, if you remember. We were still trying to work towards a two-state solution. We failed. Subsequent administrations, Trump and Biden, both, trying to be clear about this, both of them decided that was not something that we should achieve and we should negotiate. It's called the outside-in strategy. We should work with the Abraham Accords, get all the other Arab states to support us, and then when they all have diplomatic relations with Israel, then we'll get around to figuring out what to do with Gaza and the West Bank. That strategy hasn't worked. And I believe that we have to admit failure and develop a different long-term strategy. And I say that as a friend of Israel. I have lots of friends of Israel. I've gone there. I think that's in Israel's own national security interest. This idea that you could live next to a terrorist organization. I've studied Hamas. Hamas is they're not interested in a Palestinian state. They're interested in the elimination of an Israeli state. They could care less about whether there's a two-state solution. And they share that in common with some in the alliance with the current government in Israel. And I think, maybe it would have worked, I don't know, but I don't think it's worked today. And therefore, we've got to be able to have that conversation at the appropriate time.
All right, let's do one more. How about two more?
How about two more? Here,
Two more.
There's a student over here. I want to end with the student.
Thank you for doing such a great presentation for us tonight. You made a very strong and impassioned and convincing argument that the United States intelligence community was not at all involved in the Arab Spring or any of the uprisings that followed. It was such a convincing, you were so convincing, I'm almost convinced, but I do have two questions. It's really one question. Before I buy into that, number one, how can you be so certain that the intelligence community wasn't involved? And secondly, during your time in Washington, were you ever surprised about something that you found out later that the intelligence community had done that you didn't know at the time?
Yeah, great questions. On your second question, the answer is yes, and I can't talk about it because it's classified. But yes, and I appreciate that you asked that, because there were certain things that we were doing that before I was in the government I didn't know about, and you don't always know what is happening within the government, even when you worked at the National Security Council at the White House. And, intelligence is, there's unclassified, there's SBU, sensitive but unclassified. I never could figure out what that is. SBU, and then there's confidential, and then there's secret, and then there's top secret, and then above that, it's called compartmentalized information. That maybe it's changed today, but compartmentalized intelligence, you had to physically go to a special room. Where I worked at the White House, it's called a SCIF. You could read top secret intelligence in my office, right? And that's why you could never bring your phone. You had to check everything. It was one of those kinds of rooms. But for compartmentalized information, you had to go to a special part of the National Security Council, and you had to sign a piece of paper before you could read it, and you couldn't take notes on it and go out. And so I'm just telling you that because there are certain pieces of information that even with the highest security clearances one can have, I did not know about working at the White House. So that is a point well taken. Second, I want to problematize this because you've now given me the opportunity to do it. Did the CIA provide assistance to the Serbian opposition? I showed you a slide from Serbia 2000. The answer is yes. We now know that. That's a fact. That doesn't mean that they were providing assistance to the Egyptian opposition in 2011. That's the mistake that Putin makes. He says, well, if they did it here, they probably did it here. And then you ask me, well, how do I know? It's a fair question. Maybe we were providing assistance to the opposition when I worked at the White House, but I spent the entire year of 2011 working on the Arab Spring. And I knew the head of the CIA at the time. And I knew they had, he later became the head of the CIA. His name's John Brennan. I worked closely with John Brennan. Maybe he was lying to me. I've known John. I don't think he was. But I have to, you've now challenged me. Maybe he was lying to me. And that we were supporting President Mubarak, our ally for 30 years, and then quietly we're supporting the opposition to overthrow him, that later allied with the Islamists, and then we supported a coup against them 2 years later? Maybe, but that sounds a little kooky to me. Why would we want to overthrow our ally? And then when we did so, we created space for the Muslim Brotherhood to come to power in Egypt that we then supported President Sisi to overthrow 2 years later. Maybe you think we're that clever. I don't think we're that clever. And that's what I would say. Two things in conclusion on that. That's the hard part when you're the ambassador. It's called whataboutism, right? I had to deal with this all the time. Well, what about Iraq? What about what you did in Kosovo? And yes, we did that. That doesn't mean we're doing it here. And oh, by the way, two wrongs don't make a right. You can't use what we did wrongly in Iraq to justify your invasion of Ukraine. That's not the way I was taught. I see my mom here, right? Mom, two wrongs don't make a right, right? You can't, just because somebody broke into your house doesn't give you the right to break into your neighbor. That's not logical. But I think you're raising a really important question is we need to keep our leaders accountable to these kinds of things. And I appreciate the question, and we should ask that question every single day of our elected officials.
All right. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for giving us all this opportunity to come here and hear you speak so eloquently. I know, especially as a student, this has been an awesome opportunity for me. And for my question, I was wondering, in a lot of my discussions with my fellow political science peers, a lot of people have strong feelings about whether our presidency had an impact on Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. Trump's foreign policy versus Biden's foreign policy. And a lot of people think that if Trump was still in office, Putin would have been more hesitant to make his decision. So I was wondering your opinion on that. I know that you think it's mainly domestic affairs that caused this, but I'm wondering how much of an impact, in your opinion, did our presidency have on his decision to invade Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't have a great answer. I want to be clear. I'm not reading top secret intelligence. I left the government in 2014, and Putin banned me from traveling to Russia since 2014. So I don't have, I used to interact with very senior people around him. I don't that often. I do outside of the country, but I haven't been there since 2014. I think I think he was, I'm guessing, so that's what I'm trying to say, I'm guessing. I would say two things. One, Putin was waiting to see if Mr. Trump would be reelected before he decided to invade or not. Had Mr. Trump been reelected, I think he would have tried to negotiate what he's seeking to do militarily. I'm not sure he would have succeeded, by the way. I want to be clear about that. I think it's easy to say something when you're running for president, and it's a lot harder to do it. Believe me, I worked for a candidate, Obama. He said a lot of things on the campaign trail that he did not do when he was president. Mr. Trump these days is saying, things about NATO, that he's going to pull out of NATO and we're not going to defend our NATO. He just said it yesterday. Thankfully, we are not a dictatorship and we are not a monarchy. And if he's reelected, I'm going to be making the same speeches I made tonight to say why that would be a really bad idea. But if you were Putin, you would have thought you would have a better deal of negotiating the neutrality for Ukraine, right, with President Trump. That I think was a very reasonable hypothesis that Putin was going to have. And when Biden was elected, then it was like, well, we can't he's not going to negotiate with us on that. They met in Geneva in 2021, Biden and Putin did. I was there working for NBC News, and I know they talked about that, and I think that's when Putin understood that a deal he thought he might get with Trump, had he been reelected, he was not going to get with Biden. But I don't know the answer to that. Right now, it's clear to me if you watch Russian television and you listen to Putin, I watch a lot of Russian television, so you don't have to. They are waiting for our election. Again, Putin, in my world, there's lots of arguments, especially in Europe, about we got to put pressure on Zelensky to negotiate with Putin. This killing is horrible. And by the way, this killing is horrible. I want to just pause for a moment and say that. I just was in Ukraine last month. I saw lots of friends. I have lots of friends in the government and President Zelensky. It's just one of my close friends spent 45 minutes explaining to me how his brother was killed by the Russians. He's a former deputy defense minister. And it sometimes can feel abstract when we just see that map on TV, and it definitely feels abstract for me living in California. But I was just there a month ago, and it's not abstract. It's a horrific killing, and I understand why people want to find a solution. I do too. If there was a solution, we should do everything in our power to find it in the same way, I feel the same way about the war in the Middle East. But my reading of Putin, remember, he's an autocrat. He's not a Democrat. He doesn't have popular opinion. He's not facing a real election. And I think he is going to fight for as long as he has bodies to throw at the problem, and he still has a lot more people he can do, until he takes those 4 territories I was talking about. And at a minimum, he's going to fight until he knows who the next president of the United States is. Because he believes, and they say it on TV every night, that if Mr. Trump is elected, that would give him the possibility to try to do the deal that he was hoping to do before. I want to be crystal clear. I'm not so sure that's possible. I think that could be a misreading of Mr. Trump and a misreading of how easy it would be for us to dictate to the Ukrainians what they're supposed to do. This idea that we're just going to cut off the weapons and they're going to stop fighting, believe me, I was just there. That's not the spirit in Kyiv today. They fought the Russians before our weapons, and right now their mentality is we're going to keep fighting them because they have killed so many people. I think the one thing I said to students earlier today, I came out of the government humbled by our ability to influence world events. We think we can pull levers all over the place, from the Middle East to Taiwan to Russia, and we can make people do what we want. I don't think we can. But I think that's his calculus. So tragically, I don't see any possibility of a serious negotiation until we know who will be the next president of the United States.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask you one thing to close it out. We've got a lot of young faces here in the crowd,
Yeah,
which
thanks for
is
coming.
great. Thank you for coming. Some high schoolers I know as well. We talked about this as we started. It's a scary time. 2 wars, climate change, all of these things going on. You were talking to emerging leaders earlier in the master class. What advice do you have when it seems very overwhelming to stay engaged and to feel like you can have an impact? What advice do you have for a set of people that are looking at all these things and trying to figure out and navigate their way?
Aren't you going to ask me about Barack Obama's jump shot? That's a lot easier question. It's a great question, though. Well,
And you can tell us about Barack Obama.
No, it's not that interesting. So it's part of the reason I've had opportunities to do other jobs and do other things, and my answer is very personal. It's why I've chosen to spend my life and I physically live on campus of Stanford University, because interacting with young people give me hope. And I'm going to tell you 3 stories about young people that give me hope. One is I know a lot of young Russians. Some of them are living in Russia. Some of them are living in incredibly difficult circumstances because they fled their country because they disagreed with their president. And one of them is a fifth-year senior at Stanford University. Her name's Dasha Navalnaya. Dasha's dad is Alexei Navalny. He's the main opposition leader. He's the Nelson Mandela of Russia, although I always get in trouble when I mix historical metaphors, but he's a truly historic figure. But I'm using Dasha just because I know her personally. They're still fighting under incredibly difficult circumstances for a better Russia. So if they are, I got to be in the fight. I just said it before, I was just in Ukraine, and I met tons of young people. It's the young people that are running the government of Ukraine. The guy who's in charge of reconstruction, he's like 32 years old. Their minister of digital transformation, he's like 25. It's the young people that are saying, we are going to rebuild Ukraine. We are going to be part of the West. Putin is wrong about Slavic people. We do love democracy. We can be part of the West. We want to be as boring as Brussels someday and as rich as them. And it's the young people that are doing that. And if they're fighting, we should help them fight. And I feel the same thing about our country. We're in a tough time right now. I'm not an expert on America, but I work with people that are at Stanford. And one of my colleagues says this election is the second most important election in our country since 1860 because of the polarization and, invite him and have him come. Frank Fukuyama is his name. You can have him come the next time. I'm not an expert on that. But when I talk to young people, and we are in a very polarized environment right now on our campus because of what's happening in the Middle East. I just had 20 students over, and from very different political persuasions, with lots of heat about Hamas and Palestine and Israel and the United States. But we were there for 3 hours, and at the end of it, we all felt like we had advanced some kind of understanding. I'm not sure if I had been there for 3 hours with people my age that we would have come out thinking that, right? With all due respect to those that are closer to my age than these folks in the back. And that gives me hope. Like that is hope. And the last thing I'll say, it's a theme throughout all these places. Ukraine democracy today, American democracy, and Russia democracy in the future. The one great thing that democracies have that our dictator enemies and competitors don't is the possibility of renewal, right? You don't get Mao was around for a long time and you didn't get to vote him out of office and he killed millions of people there because he didn't face the possibility of renewal. We have the opportunity for renewal if we preserve our democracy, and that is usually fueled by young people. So for young people here, and I would just say, be involved, get involved, because it feels good. It's not just, it's both because we need you, but I can tell you it feels good to be involved. So thanks for coming tonight, and thanks for keeping involved.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me. We got one more piece?
So I will say, yes, we have a gift here. On our board is author and historian and a great writer, Mark Johnson, who just did something recently on Mansfield. But he wrote a book on political hellraiser, which is about Senator Wheeler.
Yes. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
And I know you don't have a lot of reading to do, but we'll just add to your book there.
Because I'm reading about the 30s, I've become much more curious about Senator Wheeler.
This will be very perfect for you.
This is perfect for me. Thank you so much.
And we also got you a gift certificate to a restaurant, so you make sure and come back.
Okay. Thank you all. All right. Thank you. Thanks for coming.